Hi, and welcome to this week's edition of Crosshairs, the show at ThePrint, where we discuss the big national security issue of the week. Thank you all for joining. Today with me, I have my colleague Pia Krishnankutti, who covers external affairs for us, has been looking closely at the Khalistan mobilization in the West, and Dr. Ajay Sani, who knows everything there is to know about the Khalistan movement. Thank you both for making the time. I'll come to you first, Ajay. Increased sort of anger, fury in India over Khalistan mobilization. Big marches of Khalistanis over the weekend, Indian diplomatic premises attacked, some apparent threats. Is this something Indian diplomacy should be reacting aggressively to, or is hysteria only feeding the beast? Should we put up a sign outside this Khalistan saying, say, do not feed the animal?
I think that's the essence of the response that we should be talking about. Do not feed the animal. We have been feeding the animal for the last very, very intensely feeding the animal over the last at least 3 years, right since that London referendum rally started. It was a non-event. It was 200 odd people gathered together who were mostly family and friends of the organizers. And we made it into an international issue. We means the government, the state, its mouthpieces, its allied media organizations. And since then, we've been doing this every time. It is governance by hysteria. It is diplomacy by hysteria. And it is feeding into the language, the idiom, and the, efforts of mobilization of the Khalistanis. So we must understand one last phrase over here, that the government is about playing the long game. It is not about screaming and shouting over every little incident without preparation for the next.
So a follow-up question from here, and I know you follow this very, very closely at ICM. Is it your sense, as many contend, that there is a significant growth in support for Khalistan in the Sikh diaspora? Or is that an overstatement? Because certainly here at home, there doesn't seem to be much going on. But then we look at these images of, trucks of people winding their way through wherever and posters coming up. Is it your sense that this reflects some sort of boom in Khalistan support overseas?
Look, there has been Khalistani support overseas throughout, during the insurgency and sustainedly after the insurgency. This has never been diluted. It is becoming more and more visible because of social media. There is, however, you see, one thing that in all fractious or conflict-ridden environments, what we hear is the most strident voices. What we see are the most dramatic and most, provocative images. And that is why the Indira Gandhi assassination float at Brampton becomes world attention, and captures world attention. And because it captures world attention, that becomes the formula or the model for future mobilization. So we have to understand this dynamic. We must also understand that there is a very strong surge of resistance to all this. People are afraid to speak because the state in each of these countries is not supporting the silent majorities among the Sikhs. There have been many instances, for instance, in Canada, every time a hardliner is nominated to the government or becomes a minister or is nominated for an election, there has been very strong reaction from the liberal faction among the Sikhs in the Liberal Party.
Right.
Many of them have left the party in the past.
They did so in 2014 in British Columbia.
And in 2021, if I remember correctly, there was another, resistance. The Liberal Party has actively promoted Khalistani extremism. When someone has spoken out against Khalistani extremism, there have been cases where these individuals have been expelled from the party. So you have to understand that this is ongoing. It is a slow, continuous effort, much more visible on the side of the extremists, less visible on the side of the invariably silent majority. What we need to do is understand the process and learn how to harness the quiet resistance against these extremist movements rather than promoting these directly. I say that India and the Indian state has promoted these movements through its hysterical reactions over every small event, every small mobilization by these groups, as a result of which you see more visible, and sometimes, at least in Brampton, for instance, the referendum, larger mobilizations. If I can get onto camera by making a particular kind of noise, I'm going to keep on making that kind of noise.
Right.
And more and more people are going to try to get onto camera.
That is the essence of propaganda.
Exactly. That's the essence of propaganda.
Yeah. Pia, I know you've been following this very closely over the last few days. And one of the things I think many Indians struggle to understand is at the end of the day, these diasporic communities are relatively tiny. Sikhs, I think some 2%, if I'm not wrong, of Canada.
1.8%. The total is about 2.4% in Canada. Again, of Punjabis.
In Australia, in the United Kingdom, not electorally significant. Why is it, Pia, that sometimes it seems that governments are bending over backwards to appease these extremist minorities? It's not like they're going to be a flood of seats they're winning or anything. Could you explain that a little for us, unpack it a little?
I think Ajay already touched on it, which is that, a lot of these Sikh communities live in what are known as swing ridings, swing districts in Canada. Toronto, Ontario, parts of BC. So they are an important vote bank for the politicians there, especially the Liberal Party, especially Trudeau. What is another thing is there are more Sikh MPs in Canada than there are in the US. They have wielded influence over the years. In fact, I have a question for Ajay, sir, which is, what are the role of Gurudwaras when it comes to the funding of these extremist elements and also the overlap in politics? That's something also I've not been able to find out much about. But to answer your question broadly, they have wielded a lot of political influence. They have nurtured that political influence over years. The geographical locations of these communities is significant. And I guess the funding part, we should throw a little more light on. Maybe Ajay sir can expand.
Ajay, does money play a big role in, if you like, buying political support for these tiny minorities, where if you control gurdwaras, you can hand out patronage?
Money is, at the heart of let's say, the tensions in Canada, in all these countries where you have these ghettos. And I think we should talk about these places as ethnic ghettos. Money is critical. And you must understand, for instance, in Canada, it's not just Gurdwara money, and I would like to talk about the Gurdwaras also. But before that, I'd like to talk about the very, very intrinsic, very intimate relationships between the Khalistani leaderships and gangs.
Right.
Relationships not only in terms of activities and support and mobilization, but also personal relationships by marriage, by by familial connections. You can trace out with each of these groups, Nijjar, even Ripudaman Singh Malik, all these fellows had gang backings. And these gang backings are critical in the control of the Gurdwaras. The Gurdwaras, you see, this is now we talk about the entire Sikh diaspora, in fact, the entire Punjabi diaspora. They are devout. The Gurdwara is a critical, not only religious, but also social institution for them. And therefore, the control of the Gurdwara becomes a very critical objective. And the control of, earlier that it was far greater. Many of the Gurdwaras have been recovered in a sense by a moderate leadership. But the extremist leadership has used every means, intimidation, violence,
right,
criminal associations, all these to essentially seize control of Gurdwaras, because the monies that flow from a very affluent and a very devout community into the Gurdwaras is enormous. Now, two things happen over here. One, these monies are then available for political donations. And two, the seizure or control of the Gurdwara makes these individuals representatives of the community, as far as the political leaderships are concerned. So both these factors then become a temptation for vote bank politicians to try to lure these individuals, to keep these individuals on their side, irrespective of the cost, irrespective of the visible flouting of Canadian law. Forget about these are terrorists in our eyes. They are groupings which are terrorists in their eyes, and their activities are being carried out in public.
I'm very curious with how the Ministry of External Affairs is dealing with some of this, especially after the attempted arson in San Francisco and pictures of diplomats being put up. Does the MEA now think there is a genuine threat to Indian facilities overseas? And if so, does it have an explanation for why governments in the United Kingdom or the United States or Canada don't seem willing to step up to base and act against individuals holding out these threats?
Well, I think last month, our Foreign Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, he said, it seems to be that the politicians in Canada are pandering to vote bank politics. So he has said it. It has been reiterated in the MEA briefing yesterday. And one of the questions that was also brought up, I'm glad you brought up San Francisco and the attempted arson attack there. One of the questions was, okay, you've summoned the Canadian High Commissioner. Why have you not summoned the US ambassador? Which there could be a lot of factors behind that. And from what it seems, from my perspective, I think the government has assessed that the major threat level is coming from Canada. And it also seems that SFJ, Sikhs for Justice, which is led by Guru Pannu, he's based in the US now. He recently put out a video from the UN headquarters in New York, but it seems that he's also wielding quite a lot of influence in Canada. That's what the feeling I get from the government, and being in several meetings and talking to my MEA sources, that the main threat is being assessed from Canada. And also,
a quick add-on question there. There have also been incidents in Australia. Of course, the famous incident at the High Commission in the UK. But the MEA continues to believe that Canada is the primary source of these.
That's because Australia, the numbers are less. They are not as well organized as UK and Canada. UK and Canada have the highest Sikh diaspora in terms of numbers in the world. US, you're seeing now, for example, some US legislators like Ro Khanna have come out and condemned these posters outright, have expressed support for the US diplomats there by name. We're not seeing a lot of Canadian politicians do that.
Right.
In the UK Foreign Secretary issued a tweet recently. He talked about the safety of Indian diplomats. We're not seeing that from the Canadian government. So I think certain statements that are missing from the countries, from Canada, those kind of hardline statements, right, outright condemning these posters and these extremists, is not seem to be coming from Canada.
Yeah. I just want to take that back a little bit further. This problem with Canada is not new. It dates all the way back to the downing of the Kanishka, when ample evidence emerged through Canadian official investigation that their intelligence services just basically weren't taking this Khalistan threat seriously at all. I know you meet with a lot of experts, with specialists in Canada and elsewhere. Do you think there has been a change in attitude, at least in the security services, or that this remains a security issue in addition to a political issue?
I think it remains a security issue also, for the simple reason that, power flows from the political executive. Directives and orientations flow from the political executive. And it is very clear, even if you see Trudeau's current responses to these incidents, to the Indira Gandhi float incident, and to other the current rally threat, it is enormously evasive, generic. Speaking of, we are committed to freedom of speech and stuff like that, but we are also committed to non-violent. But if you are committed to non-violent politics, why don't you take action against those who are directly engaged in violence or provoking violence or, engaging in evident hate speech? So the directive and the orientation seems to be flowing downwards. And there is a proclivity in I think, the enforcement and intelligence services to generally avoid any kind of confrontation or direct sort of action against the troublemakers over here. We've seen it in the past. Nijjar was, for instance, after 2018, when he was put on that list by Captain Amrinder Singh, then Chief Minister of Punjab, the list of terrorists and troublemakers, despite the fact that he was provided some evidence of a training camp, a terrorist training camp, an arms training camp held by Nijjar. He was picked up very briefly, questioned, and then let off without. So you will see, if you go into detail, you will see repeated instances or evidence of a orientation that takes infractions or crimes by these groupings far less seriously than they would be taken in the case of other militant organizations. And I think we need to always keep going back to the Kanishka bombings and understand the degree to which I do not believe, as a very good commission report, the John Majors Commission report said, that there was a cascading series of errors. I don't believe this was, mere errors. The evidence speaks of a collusive arrangement. And I do not think that collusion has entirely dissipated even today.
So let me play devil's advocate here and turn around and say, whenever we talk to Canadian diplomats about this, they will say, okay, you guys complain about a procession involving glorification of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's assassins, and you complain about gurdwaras with photographs about terrorists. But in your own city of Amritsar, among many other places, you have a museum which glorifies the same people, that has portraits. When you Indians are unwilling to act against Khalistanis, why do you expect us to act in some extraordinary fashion to things that you yourself seem to tolerate, including the display of Khalistan flags? What would your response be to this line of argument, Ajay?
I would find difficulty in responding very strongly on this, except by saying two or three things. That, first of all, are you comparing Canadian enforcement activity with Indian? I mean, would you like that parity? These diplomats should be asked that. Are we in the same sort of thing, same boat? Are you comparing a state like Punjab with 1.8 odd % of your population? We have to deal with the political management of an extremely volatile segment of a particular and substantial community concentrated in the Punjab. This is not vote bank politics. This is a politics which is, moreover, the point is, are you saying that there is direct incitement which is not acted against? If you are saying that and you can validate that with evidence, then I would be even further defensive. But as far as I'm concerned, where we see explicit calls to violence, where we see explicit hate speech, the Indian state has been acting substantially, not in every instance perhaps, not against people who tread the borderlines of, I will admit the complexity of any issue related to hate speech and mobilization where religion is at the center.
Right.
It immediately becomes problematic. But I think the laws are very clear. I think you have in Canada a particular anti-terrorism law which says that incitement to offense or the wearing or the support to terrorist organizations, and the BKI is still, the Babbar Khalsa International, is still a banned organization in Khalistan. So I'm afraid you can't sort of say, oh, but something not so good is also happening in your country. First, do you want to be judged by the same standard? You call yourself a first world country. You call yourself the Mountie always gets his man, is what I was, told. That doesn't seem to be very, very accurate. The Mountie doesn't seem to be getting his man very often, especially if he's a Khalistani or a Punjabi gangster.
Yes.
So, I mean, we need to, no country is perfect, but where you see a consistent and repeated pattern of negligence, as against certain elements of political management, or even, There's nothing, you can't tell me I can't have a Pindranwale poster in my house. You can't. Under Indian law, you can't. Just as you cannot tell the Khalistanis not to have a freedom rally in Canada. I agree with that. That's freedom of speech. I want a free Khalistan, say it. We have a member of parliament who says, I want a free Khalistan.
Yes.
So you have to make these differentiations as to what constitutes hate speech, which is criminalized by your country and by my country. What constitutes provocation to offense, incitement to offense, against which you have a law and I have a law, and what constitutes support to a terrorist organization for which both you have a law and what I have a law. And do you act on these three streams of law effectively against the Khalistanis as you do against other groupings?
Ajay, for a second, ask you to leave
I could also just add on to that.
If I may, Pia, I'll just come back to this in a second.
Sure.
Leaving aside the international dimension, till about 1993, certainly up till the end of KPS Gill's tenure as Director General of Police, there was pretty much zero tolerance of Khalistan political activism or of secessionism. And it was only following the assassination of Beyant Singh that some accommodations began to make, which gathered steam over the years, and various sort of characters who were brought back into the Indian political mainstream. As someone who followed those events very closely, I know there was a great deal of cheer that everyone, we were becoming one happy family again. Do you think we made a mistake?
No, I think we made many, many mistakes. You see, first of all, you must understand you're talking about KPS Gill's tenure, which carries on till 1995. And at that point of time, till then, this was seen as essentially a law and order issue. It was seen essentially as a military police insurgency issue, whatever you would like to describe it as. Then once, and this always happens, once the security forces achieve what are their objectives, which is containment and control, politics comes back in. And when politics comes back in, all these insects and worms who had crawled under the rocks during the insurgency, people who used to come begging for protection, suddenly became great advocates of human rights and began attacking the police, began speaking of Khalistan, began speaking once again. But let's get one thing clear. This is a small element. It is an opportunistic element which makes noise for political purposes at particular points of time, around elections, around certain events and dates. It is not a mass movement. It is a movement that is from time to time fed by our majoritarian parties as well. I love to take the example of Amritpal Singh. Right up till March this year, we were being told that India is going to be overrun by the Khalistanis because Amritpal Singh is going from place to place making speeches. There is a mass support rising in Punjab for the Khalistani movement. Mr. Amritpal Singh is now in Dibrugarh jail. There is not a voice speaking out in his support beyond things like, oh, the poor fellow is not being treated quite so well. But where is the Khalistani groundswell that everyone was speaking of? And we don't just do it with the Khalistanis. I remember when the Islamic State declared Khorasan province with India. Oh, the jihad is going to come here. The Ghazwatul Hind has begun. Hordes of Arabs are going to overrun India. It has happened before. It will happen again. We come back again and again to that idea of governance by hysteria. And now, worse, it's governance by Twitter. These are not just armies of imbeciles sitting around doing what they want. They're actually being centrally directed to engage in these hysterical.
So I take it, Ajay, I take it that you're not getting a Threads account in addition to Twitter. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Pia.
No. So it's becoming an environment of such incitement because our only purpose is to humiliate or in some sense show the adversary as small in a competition of insults and abuse, which is in fact making the adversary bigger and bigger, what we started with.
Yeah.
So if you have constantly the discourse being inflamed then don't expect it to abruptly settle because it is not working to your advantage. You are inflaming the discourse. You are pouring fuel on the fire. The point is, governance has to return. First of all, the state must understand its power. The state must understand its responsibilities. It must speak as a state, not as individuals who've been hurt, and hence scream and shout and abuse the person who is hurt, either their ego or their physical well-being. The state must speak as a state. I'm afraid that art, that skill has completely disappeared.
Just to play a devil's advocate, sir, would you classify what has happened over the last, since March, all the statements that have been coming out of MEA, would you classify that as hysteria, or is it just the Indian state responding to threats against its mission, threats against diplomats?
No, it's not so much the MEA statements. The MEA said that, look, these governments are responsible
Who is inflaming the movement and the extremists?
I think a whole lot of partisan groupings who receive their directives from those who hold power today. Everyone knows all about our little troll armies that are going around. Everyone knows where the agencies are feeding information. This may not be done in a official way. The Minister for External Affairs is going to make that, balanced little diplomatic thing that, our interests and the security of our staff is paramount, etc., etc. But then you have all sorts of feeds coming in. You see the hysteria, for instance, over Pannu's so-called
disappearance,
death by accident or assassination. These are being fed into the system. These are not something that is happening on its own. And this is the kind of thing, these are ideas that are being promoted by agencies who think that they will serve the long-term interest of the country by creating an environment of threat, by taking implicit credit for actions abroad, which I am very, very uncertain we have the capacities or capabilities to actually execute, and for which far more credible explanations exist. Niger was deeply involved in gang conflicts, particularly over Gurudwara politics, particularly over Ripudaman Singh Malik, who was killed after threats from Niger.
Right, and Malik himself had a very unsavory financial background.
But you see, now somebody somewhere has decided that everybody is saying that this is done by the Indian agencies. Let's take advantage of it. Let's frighten all the Khalistanis. I think this is immature. I don't think anybody from let other people speak about your wonderful actions, if at all these are your wonderful actions, rather than trying to plant these stories, rather than trying to promote hysteria through these very dangerous social media sort of campaigns. And rather than just trying to get, your tweets to go viral. This is, I know what these instructions are sent out. Hey, isko viral karo. So, and nobody's looking at tomorrow. I would understand, yes, if there was a real communication strategy behind this. We knew where this was going, but we evidently don't know where this was going because it has gone in the wrong direction over the past 3 to 4 years. Ever since 2020, we have been feeding the hysteria. Let me also make one thing very clear. This also feeds very well into majoritarian politics. Bharat khatre mein hai, Hindu khatre mein hai. Earlier on, it was just because of the Musalman. Now it is because of the Sikh as well, the Khalistan. So if you have this kind of divisive, polarizing politics at the core, then you want to, while as government, you want to minimize and contain threats. As political party, you want to exaggerate threats. This is the conflict that we are seeing that is working out over here. And that is, in fact, feeding visible Khalistani manifestations.
So we're clean out of time, and thank you again, Ajay. You've given us a lot to think about. Pia, thank you for the insights into the way the Indian government is thinking about this, and of course into the sort of nitty-gritty of Canadian politics. This debate is not going to go away, and we will be at the print watching it with the closeness and attention and dispassion I think this issue deserves. The print, fortunately, is one of those few places in journalism that is not driven by Twitter, and we mean to keep it that way. Thank you so much for watching Crosshairs this week.